A professor was studying what makes one team higher performing than another team. His name was Kevin Kniffin. His dad was a firefighter, and he grew up hanging out with the guys, and mostly the guys, in the firehouse. He decided to study the firehouses when he was getting his PhD. And what he found was that the firefighters who were the most dedicated to the ritual of the firehouse meal, sitting around the table, connecting as humans, it correlated with higher levels of performance, and those firefighters actually saved more lives.
Erica, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. How's life? You're on tour now.
I am coming to you on the front lines of the retention revolution. I have had good travel karma, except for 2 days ago. That was not fun, but it's been great. Been
Yeah.
great being out there in the world.
Before we jump in, tell everyone a little bit more about your background and just sort of the journey to where we are now, and obviously a little bit about the new book, and then we'll jump in.
I've been in the human resources, human capital space for 25-ish years. I worked at Russell Reynolds, recruiting heads of HR, worked at the Hay Group doing HR consulting. And now my work really is focused on helping companies improve performance through people. And what I often say is, HR, those of us in the space, we're really finally having our moment that, we've always known that this is not just the soft stuff, it's the hard stuff and the important stuff, but the rest of the world has finally caught on. So it's been really exciting.
What was the inspiration behind the new book, The Retention Revolution?
Well, as we know, everything we knew or know or thought we knew about work changed overnight in March of 2020. I will say that a lot of the trends that I talk about in the book were not new, but they were accelerated by a gazillion years by the pandemic. And so the idea behind the new book, there are in many organizations 4 or 5 generations working under one roof, and how people are thinking about work, thinking about their careers, looking at it as a portfolio is very different. I say, having been a recruiter back in the day, if I saw a resume with somebody moving around so much, it was a big red flag. Now this is just what it's going to be. So the focus on the book and why it's called the retention revolution is, gone are the days where, we as people leaders need to think about, how do we have golden handcuffs and chaining people to the desk or the chair? We need to be really intentional about how we onboard people early and often, let them know what our values are and how we live them. While they're with us, we help them learn and develop up, down, and sideways. And if and when they come and tell us they're leaving, which they probably will at some point, we need to refrain from the don't let the door hit you in the behind, figure out ways to stay connected, because work is going to be, and already is, much more of a virtuous cycle.
I think especially now that work is no longer a place that you go to, right? You mentioned sort of
Yeah.
chaining people to the desk. There is no desk in many of these companies. So that's also completely forced companies to rethink this.
100%. And I love what you said, because the subtitle of the book is 7 Surprising and Very Human Ways to Keep Your Employees Connected. We keep them connected by threading the needle and reminding them what they do is connected to the bigger purpose of the organization, how their role matters, regardless of what it is. We help curate connection in person, online, at your local Starbucks, or wherever you might be working. And you help connect people to their colleagues, to their customers, and even helping connect them, to themselves. Just a few minutes ago, I guess you got off of a webinar that focused on wellness. I mean, that's a piece of it too.
I got a feeling as well when you wrote that subtitle that when you put very, human ways, you was very intentional. Why did you use that word?
This is cheesy, but, left to our own devices, we're not connecting. And without that intentionality, it's just not going to happen. And one of the things that I think about a lot these days, and I think this is for someone who might be a business owner, a senior leader, a middle manager, someone in HR, or a new person entering the workplace. Everyone is trying to figure out, how do we optimize for this desire, AKA demand for flexibility, but also this human need for connection. I mean, at least in 2023, even though we have all this great AI out there, we are still human. And, we have to figure out how to stay connected. And, again, you just came off this wellness webinar. I think a lot about, work doesn't necessarily have a place, a desk. Some companies it does, some it doesn't. But how do we think about that in addition to, the Surgeon General that just came out with the report that talks about the loneliness an isolation epidemic. And so it's up to the people leaders to identify ways to curate connection and identify ways for people to come together. It could be for an hour, it could be for a day. I just got back from Seattle 2 days ago, where one of their big, their future of work group was kicking off what they call Team Week, that they're distributed. They have a lot of people in Seattle, but they have people all over. They're not asking them all to move to Seattle. Twice a year, they have everybody come to Seattle for Team Week. And it is one full week of highly curated activities, volunteering. And what they don't want to have everybody come to Seattle and have everybody sitting in their own corners, just sending out their emails and doing, being on Teams calls. So it's very, very intentional. And what you find is that when humans connect, their oxytocin goes up, their feel-good hormone, stress goes down. And there is a physiological response in our body when we connect with other humans. And so the goal of these team weeks is to really foster and deepen these connections, because as we know, once you meet someone in person, the tone and the tenor of how you communicate with them online completely shifts.
And you learn so much more about each other as well, and find similarities, and that connection, of course, is then going to result in innovation in the organization, right? New ideas that can be sparking different functions that, as you said, if you wasn't intentional, probably would never even meet each other as well, right? And also they feel connected to the culture of what it means to work for that organization, which is sometimes difficult when you're working remote.
A lot of my work, all three of the books are inspired by a study out of Cornell, where a professor was studying what makes one team higher performing than another team. His name is Kevin Kniffin. And his dad was a firefighter, and he grew up hanging out with the guys, and mostly the guys, in the firehouse. And the short version of what he found, he decided to study the firehouses when he was getting his PhD. And what he found was that the firefighters who were the most dedicated to the ritual of the firehouse meal, sitting around the table, connecting as humans, it correlated with higher levels of performance, and those firefighters actually saved more lives. So there was this correlation between connection and performance. And I know, there are going to be people listening that aren't going into an office, full-time or maybe even part-time, but even using this example from Microsoft, I'm not out there saying you must come in, 2.5 days a week. That's the sweet spot. But the idea is, it goes back to, this idea of being intentional, that we still need to find time to connect with other people, because there is an ROI, and it does impact performance.
One of the things I love about a book is how you talk about old ideas and moving from old ideas to new beginnings. Could you talk about one of the areas that's one of your favorites that we could kind of jump into?
One of the old ideas and new beginnings is around, there's a chapter called From Ladders to Lilypads. Gone are the days that everybody, is going to just go up one rung in the ladder. And then 50 years later, you're gonna retire with a plaque and pension. And sort of this new idea is that if within an organization, if you don't create an ecosystem for growth and help people grow up, down, and sideways, they will, that's why it's called From Ladders to Lilypads, they will hop on over to another company. I am seeing that, you asked before we started recording, I was sharing some of the places where I've been since the book came out. Although funny, it only came out a week ago. I feel like I've been in 100 places. And it is one of the things that I'm hearing from HR leaders. I really do believe, especially when we think about Generation Z that's taking over the workforce by storm, even more than compensation, right? They want to get paid. If they don't feel like they are growing, they are going to leave. And so it is something that we all need to think about in the HR space. What I love about this idea, it doesn't have to cost a ton of money. If you are listening and you have a small company, and, or even just within your team, and you have 10 people on your team, and you can create a spreadsheet that says, how does everybody want to learn and develop? What are some projects? How can we match them? And kind of call it a day. I heard an amazing example, and then I'll share some examples of some of the big systematic ways that companies are doing this as well, which I also love. But just a small anecdote where, anybody can do some of this stuff, if they decide it's important to them. So I heard a leader on a podcast recently who said to her team, I'm not in charge of what's going on with the macroeconomic swings, between the expansions and the contractions in the market. I can only control what I control. But here's what I'm going to tell you. To her 8 people on her team, she said, go out and find a job description of a job that you might want in 3 to 5 years. It could be within this company or it could be in any company. Just bring it to me. And then let's look at the skills you would need for that job. And let's look at the skills that you have now. And let's do a gap analysis. She said, what I can do for you and what I will do is help you close the gaps. And if a boss said that to me,
Yeah.
I mean, well, I wouldn't go anywhere. This is the devil that I know. These are I hopefully have friends at work. I generally like what I'm doing, but this boss is going to help me grow and develop, which will help me forever. So, I don't want, and in my book, I have companies from examples from all kinds of companies, not just these big companies that, can afford these systems. But I think where there's a will, there's a way, even on an individual manager level. I also profile some companies in this chapter, Citigroup, for example, where, big, huge company. And I met with Jolson Cohen, who runs their learning and development for the HR organization. And what I thought was interesting about this example in particular was sort of the shoemaker's children, where they felt that they were helping everybody else in Citi grow and develop, but didn't focus on themselves as
Yeah.
HR professionals. So they created what they called the Experience Hub. It's much more systematic than, these previous examples that I gave. But the idea was to say to, 10,000 people in HR, I mean, you're still talking about a lot of people when you have a company like Citi. How do you want to grow and develop? And let's get these projects. And what's really interesting, that what the data shows is that if I say to someone, hey, Erica, you're in sales and I want you to give us 20% more effort, I might do it, but I'm not going to be thrilled to do that much more of the same thing I'm already doing. But the data shows that if somebody says, I'm in, let's say, learning and development, and I really want to dip my toe and get more hard skills around people analytics, let's say, I am willing to give an extra 20%. So not 80-20, in terms of, back in the day, Google did the work 4 days and you want 4 days in one thing and do a project, but people are willing to go above and beyond. So it's good when you think about learning and development this way. Yes, it's work to do this matching and helping people grow, but it's good for the person. And it's also good for the company because they probably will stay, but you're also getting extra effort from the people that are being given these opportunities. So I think it's a win-win-win all around.
100%. And you're developing those skills that you need for the future at the same time, right? So it's a win-win-win-win on either.
Well, right. And I would add one more extra win to your win column, which is that, to your point earlier, like, people are generally siloed, especially in this new hybrid world, that you're hardly meeting people from all over.
Yeah.
When somebody works in one area and then gets exposure to another, they are then getting exposure to the company in a much more holistic way and are able to connect the dots. So, this is one of the things I think in 2024, everybody should put on their bucket, their bucket list of things to at least investigate and say, what is my company doing? And what are some things that I can do to move the needle, to start to do more in this area?
It's so interesting because literally on Tuesday, I was interviewing the CHROs of Siemens and Ubisoft, two shows in the same day. And both of them during the episodes wanted to talk about talent mobility and to talk about the talent marketplaces that they're building. And they were so excited about it for all the reasons that we just mentioned, but also adding in things like mentorship. So within the talent marketplace, as an employee, I can send a request to a leader to be my mentor, right? So now you've got that knowledge exchange, just not leaving the business. Even when that leader does leave, at least you're retaining that. And now that, and also talking about how their employees now feel so empowered and they're taking charge of their own careers, right? No longer are the days that you're waiting for the pat on the shoulder to do that. And then and then linking that back to the skills, right? They can see, okay, this is where I am, this is where I want to go, these are the skills I need to be there, and then linking that back into their LMS or LXP to then create a custom learning pathway specifically for careers. Super powerful.
Yeah, and I agree. It empowers people. Here are two other things I would add, and maybe this came up in your conversations with them. There needs to be, to make these talent mobility and these ecosystems successful, you also need the change management to go along with
100%.
it. Because let's say that you have this great system that enables nudges to come to Chris to say, hey, you said you're interested in this role. but there's not that. But maybe you still have a manager who wants to hoard talent, and Chris is crushing it in his role. So if I'm your manager, I don't want to let you go. But let's say that the managers really need to be trained, and need to be expectations. And then the last piece of it, and I've been thinking a lot about, is on the recognition side. I mean, what about if 6 months from now, a year from now, at your annual get together, the managers who had the most people in their teams internally moving get a gold star,
Yeah,
get a
yeah.
whatever, because all of these things need to be aligned. There's the systems and the processes, and then the change management piece, which I think is also so critical, because you want to have the sense of psychological safety to raise your hand to say, this job's out there. Is my boss really gonna, and that's what the retention revolution is about. If you love them, let them leave the company or your department, and trust that it ends up being good for the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, to your point, exactly what happened during those conversations. I asked, what was the biggest challenge? Of course, they mentioned the change management. They did specifically say, though, to your point, how do we change the mindset of managers from being talent importers to talent exporters?
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah, right. I remembered it from the conversation, and that's a big culture shift. Like again, like what you said, also the way leaders are traditionally compensated doesn't work in that new context. So you also have to think about that, like you said, rewarding managers for being talent exporters, and being public
Right.
about that, and talking about it in leadership meetings, and and making sure that's part of your values actually, in culture, and in ingraining that
Yeah.
in the business as well, right?
You heard it here. You heard it here. One thing I would say that I would add to that, there's a chapter in the book. People say, "What's your favorite chapter?" It's like asking me which is my favorite child. It depends on the day. But there's a chapter called "Managers Are Having a Moment," and I would also put on my bucket list for 2024 is that many companies did, and I stated back then, and I would state it now, I didn't fully agree with what was going on when some companies, not to be named, were just getting rid of all of their middle managers. I would say that, and middle isn't a great word, they're at the center. And these managers are on the front lines of this revolution. So when the leader comes and says, okay, we're going from 3 days to 4 days in the office. Okay, manager, you go tell everybody about it. All of these things that we're dealing with, the mental health and the wellness issues, these managers on the front line. So it reminded me when you were talking about, let's celebrate these managers as talent exporters. The chapter is about elevating and celebrating managers. It is harder to be a manager now. It was always hard. I think it is that much harder now. But if we really elevate the role and make the role not just make it a destination. It's always like, all right, I'm going to be a manager. It's like a pass through. But if we sort of say, okay, managers, you are on the front lines. We need you to be successful, and we need you to help move people around, because development is so critical to Gen Z, and we need you to do all these things, and we're going to celebrate you. Again, I think it's such a critical piece of this whole puzzle right now.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because a lot of the conversation I had today during that webinar was around celebrating that, and recognizing. And one of the leaders said that in the data they saw within the line managers, that those managers that were recognized 4 times a year were 50% more likely to stay with the company. Which really says something, right? 4 times, it's not a lot, right? We're not talking about a huge amount here that are being recognized for the hard work they're doing, are 50% more likely to stay the
And even
company.
having events for these people managers. I do work. I was just at the big L'Oreal HR global, the HR offsite a couple of weeks ago.
With Stephanie.
Yeah, with Stephanie. So Stephanie Kramer, the new
Yeah, she's amazing.
head of HR for L'Oreal USA. One of the things that she has started doing, and she said the last one was unbelievable, was a people manager town hall. It's a full day of learning and development just for the people managers. And she did it for 3,000 people managers. And you are invited to this, even if you're managing one person. So talk about a way of elevating. And she had, speakers and excitement around this job of being a people manager, which we know is hard, and not everybody wants to do it. And so it's like, how do we make it a thing, and make it a thing that is exciting, that people want to do, and sort of be part of the movement.
Yeah, I love that, because sometimes it can be lonely being a manager
Oh
or a
my
leader,
God.
right? So being in that room and having, oh, they're probably the first thing they're probably, oh, it's not just me. It's not just me that's having all of these challenges and
Yes,
struggles.
yes.
Oh, and they finally have a group that they can really be vulnerable with and have conversations. So I'm sure that I'm sure those meetings have a huge impact.
Yeah.
And
No, and you clearly have your pulse on what's going on, because also in that chapter, I highlight a bunch of companies that have ways for managers to just bond with each other. And sometimes it's not, HR is not there. The senior leaders are, it is just the managers
yeah,
to do exactly what you just said, to not feel alone. I almost equate it, you're gonna laugh, but like in a parenting moment when like when my kids were little, I was in this parenting group and my husband was there. And the first time, some woman was like, she was crying. My kid just said she hated me. And then everybody was like, oh my gosh, I'm not alone. My kid said that too. And then someone says, that's normal, right? So it's normalizing
yeah,
these challenges that these managers are going through.
yeah. Especially when they're taking on kind of, I won't say new things, but when I was a manager, I wasn't really having conversations around well-being
Oh my
with
gosh, no.
my team, right? So it's such a subject where most managers are so they're not prepared. They don't really know what right questions to ask. Do I say this? Am I going to say the wrong things? And then they say nothing at all, which is the worst thing you can do, right? And then so being able to have those conversations and be like, oh, okay, what's working, what's not. And bearing in mind, they're also trying to take care of themselves at the same time, let alone their team. What are some of the practical things that you're sharing in your book that leaders that are listening can do with their teams and their managers?
During the last couple of years, especially in the beginning of the pandemic, managers, leaders they were more human, right? My first book was called Bring Your Human to Work. And during that time, I would never want to go back to March of 2020, but I also don't want to forget pieces of what we saw and how we felt. That leaders were more human. They were checking in and they were saying to their people, how are you really, really doing? And so, yes, we're busy. And again, in the beginning, in March of 2020, people were spending 60 minutes of a 60-minute meeting checking in. Are you okay? Is your family okay? Is your technology working? Like, we want to make sure that people are alive and that our companies, at least we can keep the lights on. About a year out, maybe 30 minutes of a 30-minute meeting. But now, we're past that, which I'm happy we're past it. But I do urge people to figure out ways to keep checking in. And so there's a lot of examples in the book. It could be 5 minutes in the beginning of a meeting, whether it's, what is your energy level? Or there's a funny one that I talk about in the book. It's called Pick Your Nick, which they do at a company called Mural.
Okay.
And there's 9 images of Nicolas Cage, and
Oh, different
it has,
expressions.
yeah, with different expressions like
That's
stressed
so funny.
or meh or bees, or and each one's connected with a different
Yeah,
movie.
yeah.
And it's hilarious. And people will just pick one. The idea, though, is not to say, like, stop the meeting. Why is Chris stressed? But it does a couple things. And it's a reminder. It says, okay, if you and I are working on a project together that day, and in the beginning you say that you are stressed, red light, as your peer, I might give you more grace if I don't hear back from you right away. And as a manager, information like this is just gold, to be able to call you later in the day and say, all right, Chris, what's going on? How are you really, really doing? People think, okay, we're over it, but it is something that we have to keep doing.
It's funny you say that because my daughter just started school and they do that when the kids come into the classroom. So they kind of have like the faces on the kind of different expressions, and the kid chooses
Oh,
when they
cool.
walk in the door whether they're a sad face or a happy face or etc. And they also have like a sort of a traffic light system. So
Yep.
when Robin comes home, she'll be like, "Oh, Daddy, I had a green day today," right? And it's really
I love
cool.
it. Yep. I have that in the book too. I have leaders that say, go around, either what is a word that describes how you're feeling today, or red, green, or yellow.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah,
taking the pulse in that moment. It's inclusive. Everyone participates. And it's just taking a moment. Or, some companies have rituals. I wrote in my rituals book, Eileen Fisher has something where they ring a chime before every meeting, and they just stop, they take a minute, and the chime is intended to sort of take away the outside noise and to focus. Or Toyota has someone shares a safety moment that, again, like, gets
yes,
us focused and in the present moment, and it's aligned with a company value that we're all about safety. So I think there's so many cool examples, and I love that they're doing it with young kids in school. I wish they were doing it. I wish they were doing it with my kids in college these days, but it is important. Take a beat, take a moment, take a breath.
There's a lot in the book, but what's the one thing you really want people to take away from the book that would fill you with joy?
It's the $1 million question that we're all struggling with. How do we optimize for this desire for flexibility and the human need for connection? In the chapter on flexibility, I talk about how do we ace flexibility? We need to think about flexibility through the lens of autonomy and agency. Everybody wants to have a little bit of autonomy over their jobs.
Yeah.
Not everybody can have the same amount, right? The person who's checking people in at a hotel can't have the same as an IT worker that can do everything from home, but it's important. The second part of ACE is designing for connection, these moments that matter. And the third is thinking about flexibility through the lens of equity. And not everything is going to be equal, but we can think about it through the lens of equity. And so,
love that.
Kind of checking in with ourselves and with our teams of how are we optimizing for both? It's going to tip and it's not always going to be perfect, but we need to keep coming back to this moment. And I know you said one, but I'm going to say one more. The second one that I really think about for any leader out there, and it really sums up a lot of what we've talked about, which is when you have to say we're rolling out this new program, or we're going to switch how many days we're coming back to the office, whatever it is that you're doing in this moment, my recipe for a good manager, a good leader in this moment is the following. Approach it through the lens of vulnerability if you're comfortable. Like, you know what? This is also hard for me, and here's why. The second is through the lens of empathy. Chris, I know this is hard. We've been 3 steps in and 1 step back, and 2 steps forward and 2 steps back. And yes, we've been changing, but this pendulum is swinging. So the empathy piece, which we can all learn from your daughter. And the third piece is to approach it through the lens of experimentation. And I think that's the note that I would end on, which is we're all walking around with our shoulders like this. And if you're going to roll out a change of any kind to say the world, everything we know about work has been shifted and turned upside down, we're going to try this. This is an experiment. We're going to reserve the right to change it. We want to hear back from you and co-create. I think it takes the temperature off of pretty much anything. So I would try that.
Well, listen, we need to save some for people to buy the book. So I absolutely love it. I love what you're doing.
Yes.
And when
Here it is.
Yeah, and there it is. When we first connected, I was like, I need to get this into the hands of all of the HR leaders that listen to the show, and not just HR leaders, every manager, every leader. I think what we speak about sits with every single leader and individual in the organization. We all own this together. Yes. So last thing I'd say before I let you go, where can people connect with you? If they want to reach out to you personally, say hi, work with you, where's the best place?
Find me I'm on LinkedIn a lot. You can just look up my name. My website is just ericakeswin.com. And I have a human newsletter that goes out, once or twice a month. I'm also on all the other social media.
Amazing. And as always, everyone listening, all those links are below. So wherever you're listening or watching, they're already right there. So there's no excuse. Go click there, grab a copy of the book. Make sure you go connect with Erica. But honestly, I love what you're doing, and I appreciate you coming on the show, and look forward to doing it again soon.
Thank you so much.